Hey guys, in this video I'm going to talk about the true cause of type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance. This is a topic that the mainstream has gotten completely wrong, so I'm going to explain what's really causing these conditions. Let's begin with the typical or mainstream view of type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance. These conditions are characterized by elevated blood sugar levels. Insulin is the hormone that allows the sugar from the blood to enter the cells. So it's assumed that in these conditions, the cells aren't properly responding to insulin. In other words, insulin resistance is considered to be a transport problem, where the issue is that the sugar from the blood can't be transported into the cells. This has led to the idea that as our cells are exposed to greater amounts of insulin, they begin to become resistant to its effects. This has then led to the recommendations to consume foods that don't raise the blood sugar too much and therefore don't raise insulin too much. So there's common recommendations to consume low glycemic foods and stay away from higher glycemic foods, which typically turns into the recommendations to consume complex carbohydrates as opposed to simple carbohydrates and sugars. There's many problems with these recommendations that I'll get to a little bit later on in the video. To put it bluntly, the mainstream view of insulin resistance and diabetes and the recommendations that come with them are completely backwards. In fact, insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes aren't really transport problems or even insulin problems at all. Rather, it all starts inside the cell. When sugar or glucose enters the cell, it's used to produce energy through a process called glucose oxidation. Now, the issue in type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance is that this process of energy production or glucose oxidation is inhibited. This leads to sugar or glucose buildup in the cell, which then prevents more sugar from the blood from entering the cell. In other words, it's not a matter of the cells responding to insulin properly, it's that the cells are already full of sugar and can't accept any more. There's quite a bit of evidence for this alternative view of type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance. Firstly is the finding that in diabetics, glucose uptake, or the transport of glucose or sugar from the blood into the cells, occurs at normal levels when the blood sugar is elevated, even when insulin levels are normal. This suggests that the cell's response to insulin isn't what's inhibiting the transport of glucose into the cell. Second is the finding that glucose oxidation, or the production of energy from sugar, is inhibited in type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance. As I mentioned earlier, this is what leads to a buildup of glucose or sugar in the cell, which inhibits more sugar from the blood from entering the cell. And of the glucose that is used to produce energy, the process of glycolysis is favored as opposed to the entire process of glucose oxidation. This basically means that only a small fraction of the total amount of energy that can be produced from glucose is produced from glucose. The third piece of evidence is the finding that hepatic glucose production, or the production of sugar from the liver, is increased in type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance. Hepatic glucose production is the primary mechanism our bodies use to raise our blood sugar. And this typically occurs when our blood sugar is low or when our bodies are under stress. And in these situations, the hormones glucagon, adrenaline, and cortisol are produced, and this is what stimulates the production of glucose from the liver. But in insulin resistance and diabetes, the liver produces glucose even though the blood sugar is already elevated. And this happens because, as I mentioned earlier, the cells aren't effectively using sugar to produce energy, and this puts the body under stress. This is largely what's responsible for the elevated blood sugar levels seen in type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance, and it also accounts for insulin's blood sugar lowering effects. In these conditions, insulin primarily lowers the blood sugar by inhibiting hepatic glucose production, rather than by increasing glucose uptake or transport. As I mentioned earlier, the glucose uptake or transport is more dependent on the amount of glucose oxidation that's going on rather than the cell's response to insulin. I'll link to the studies supporting these points in the description below. So, considering that type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance aren't caused by too much insulin causing the cells to stop responding to insulin, and are instead caused by inhibited glucose oxidation, this completely changes the approach to treating these conditions. It also brings up many problems with the typical or mainstream recommendations for type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance. The most common recommendations are to favor low glycemic foods rather than higher glycemic foods, and consume complex carbohydrates instead of simple carbohydrates and sugars. but there's several issues with these recommendations. The first, which we've already touched on a few times in this video, is that increases in blood sugar and stimulation of insulin production doesn't cause insulin resistance. Secondly is the idea that complex carbohydrates have higher glycemic indexes than simple carbohydrates and sugars. Firstly, the distinction between complex and simple carbohydrates isn't really all that helpful, and rather it makes more sense to differentiate between starches and sugars. Starches, which are found in grains and root vegetables like potatoes, are made up of entirely glucose, whereas sugars, which are found in fruits and honey and even white table sugar, are made up of a combination of glucose and fructose. Now, based on the way that glucose and fructose are digested, glucose increases the blood sugar to a much higher degree than fructose-containing foods do. And this is even seen in the glycemic index. Foods like fruits or fruit juice are much lower in the glycemic index because they raise blood sugar to a much lower degree than starches like potatoes or grains, whether they're whole grains or refined grains. In other words, the idea to avoid sugars in favor of grains, even whole grains, doesn't make much sense from the mainstream view of these conditions. The next common recommendation for these conditions is low-carb or ketogenic diets. And while low-carb or ketogenic diets might be slightly better than eating a standard diet of grains and vegetable oils, it really just avoids the underlying issue that we've talked about in type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance. And that underlying issue is that glucose oxidation is inhibited. When you go on a low-carb or ketogenic diet, you just don't consume any carbohydrates, so your body really never has to address the fact that glucose oxidation is inhibited. Aside from that fact, low-carb diets and ketogenic diets cause many problems that go beyond the scope of this video, but I'll link to a couple articles about this in the description. So now that we've considered the issues with the mainstream view of these conditions and the mainstream recommendations for these conditions, we can consider what we should actually do for type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance. As you know by now, the fundamental issue in type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance is inhibited glucose oxidation. Remember, that's the process that we use to produce energy from sugar. This is a relatively complex process and is affected by virtually every aspect of our environment. The food that we eat is vitally important for this process, as certain foods can inhibit glucose oxidation and others are required in order to oxidize glucose. Many other aspects of our environment, whether it's sunlight or emotional stress, can also affect this process. I'll have videos in the future directly addressing this issue, but in the meantime, if you'd like some more guidance, you can sign up for my free 6-day mini course on type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance. If you're watching this video on my website, just scroll down to sign up, and if you're watching on YouTube, you can click on the link in the description. I hope this video helped clarify what's really going on in type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance, and I'll talk to you guys soon.